Everyone believed the countdown had already started when the monitors began to sound like a metronome for endings, and a senior physician, with a voice that had delivered too many hard truths, told the billionaire father that his son had only 48 hours, maybe less, and that there was nothing left to do but make him comfortable. But everything changed because of someone no one expected to matter in the story, a quiet maid who noticed what experts missed, who paid attention when the world had already decided how the story would end. And what she found in a place no one thought to look would turn grief into light, redraw the future, and remind everyone that love doesn't need a title, just courage. Your son has only 48 hours, doctors told the billionaire, until the maid proved them wrong. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Sebastian Ward did not look like a man people pitied, not on magazine covers or earnings calls, not in the tall glass rooms where decisions traveled faster than the sun, but alone, without an audience. He looked older than his 43 years, tired in a way sleep couldn't fix, a man who had built towers of success but lived in a house that felt like a museum for echoes. His wife, Lena, had died in a sudden accident when their son Isaac was 2, and grief had taught him that money could cushion pain, but not erase it. So he moved his life to a quiet, cliffside mansion an hour from the city, hired a small, discreet staff, and focused every ordinary minute on his boy, who grew up sweet and curious, and fond of little cars with chipped paint and stories about the sea. And then, without warning, the good days thinned. Isaac started stumbling, then sleeping too much, then complaining that the lights were too bright and the room was spinning when he was perfectly still. And when the fevers came in waves and the headaches made him cry softly into pillows, Sebastian stopped pretending work mattered at all and sat beside him through the nights while specialists with careful voices filled whiteboards with ideas that sounded like storms. The mansion carried the weight of worry in its long hallways, and the staff kept a respectful quiet. Among them was Maya Alvarez, 28, hired to keep the house running, to fold towels into clean stacks and make simple meals, to stay invisible the way good help was supposed to. But it didn't take long for everyone to notice she did something the others didn't. She listened to Isaac the way people listen to music, not just for words, but for pauses, for the way breath catches between them. She had come from a smaller life, crossing borders with resilience sewn into her, and carried a private wound she never offered easily. A little brother who had gotten sick when they were young and went quiet in a clinic where no one had time to notice small things, the kind you only see if you care enough to look twice. And since then, Maya had learned to move gently and see what most people missed. Isaac's world shrank to hospital rooms with soft beeping and voices that slipped in and out like tides. And over 3 urgent weeks, his case moved from "we're running tests" to "we think we know" to "we've tried everything." And somewhere in that fast unraveling, he stopped walking unassisted and needed help to grip a spoon. His words slowed, his eyelids felt heavier. And then, one night when the monitors told the kind of truth you can hear without understanding, a neurologist with gray at his temples and compassion in his eyes paced his sentences slowly and told Sebastian and the team that Isaac's body was failing despite aggressive care, that the swelling in his nervous system refused to give, that the cascade was moving too fast, and that if there was a miracle left, it would have shown itself by now. 48 hours, he said, not cruelly, but carefully. And the words sat in the air like a verdict. People who loved them brought food they couldn't eat and books they wouldn't read, and Sebastian signed whatever papers eased discomfort and discharged responsibility. And then the room went softer and heavier at the same time. Light came in and sat on the floor like a guest who didn't want to stay. And in the middle of that stillness, while nurses adjusted lines and gently wiped Isaac's face,
Maya did what she always did. She hovered nearby with quiet hands and noticed the smallest things, like how Isaac flinched when she brushed a certain spot near his left ear. Not pain exactly, but a flinch, and how his breathing changed when air moved across his scalp. It was nothing, probably nothing, but all the big things had already been tried, so small things were all that were left. She asked permission to wash his hair, not out of vanity, but to make him feel human again. Warm water, a little lavender soap, the kind he liked, and no one said no. She warmed the basin, wrapped towels around his neck, and moved slowly, carefully, like every pass of her fingers mattered. When her nails grazed the hairline behind his ear, Isaac's eyelids tightened and released, a tiny reflex, and she paused, parted the hair with her thumb, leaned closer, and frowned. There, nearly hidden in thick strands and weeks of worry, something dark clung to skin the size of a seed, round, patient, uninvited. Maya's heart started racing, not from fear but recognition, a memory of removing a similar thing from a stray dog she once fed behind her building, the way her grandmother had taught her to check behind ears and under collars after summer walks, because small creatures can steal big health in silence. "Nurse?" she called softly, and when the nurse came, she pointed with 2 fingers, respectful, tentative. The nurse squinted, then inhaled sharply and fetches a light. In the bright circle, the thing looked obvious in the way hindsight always is, a tiny parasite engorged and quiet, attached where eyes had not gone. And the nurse looked at Maya, then at the doctor, then back at Maya, and said, "It might be nothing, and also, we should remove it," and the room changed without anyone moving. Protocols hummed to life, gloves, sterile tools, a consult, but before any removal, the attending physician stepped in, skeptical not of the finding but of its relevance. He was a good man, but he had been trained to trust large patterns, big scans, data points that fill screens, not tiny dots on a scalp. And yet, the infectious disease specialist who had been told to take a look said quietly, "There is a known syndrome where certain parasites release a toxin that can cause progressive weakness that looks like other things. If it's that, removal can reverse symptoms within hours to days. If it's not, we lose nothing by taking it out." And nobody breathed for a second. In the corner, Sebastian stood like a statue with a pulse, fists tight, eyes on a detail he had never been taught to see, and then he said the only thing that mattered. "Do it." They did not let Maya touch the tools. Of course they wouldn't. But they let her stand closer than protocol usually allows because Isaac's hand, even sleepy and heavy, reached for her without opening his eyes, and she let his small fingers wrap around 2 of hers while the specialist used a device that twisted without tearing and lifted the stubborn dot away from skin it had hidden in for too long. The nurse captured it, labeled it, sent it for testing, and the whole room, exhaled. Not in triumph, but in fragile hope. They cleaned the site, checked the lines, documented the moment, and then everyone looked at Isaac not with grief, but with a question. Would anything change? That night, Sebastian slept in a chair and didn't really sleep. He stared at his son's chest rising and falling and told the dark each sentence he'd avoided saying for months. "I'm sorry I missed that day. I'm sorry I pushed too hard. I'm sorry I couldn't fix it." And somewhere around dawn, Isaac sighed a little differently, less effortful, and when the sun reached through the blinds to touch the blankets, Maya whispered his name and saw his eyelids flutter like someone deciding whether to wake, and when they opened, not fully but more than before, she felt her whole body shake from the inside. "Hi, buddy," she said, careful to keep her voice steady, and he moved his fingers against hers, not by accident, but like a boy who had found a rope in a river.
Doctors came fast, the kind of fast you don't plan, and they checked reflexes and responses and everything that could be measured. Nothing was dramatic yet, but the monitors had softened their warnings, and Isaac's breathing had stopped arguing with itself. "It's early," the infectious disease specialist said, cautious and hopeful, "but this can happen," and he sent for a test that would name the tiny thief and the toxin it had delivered. People who traffic in certainty do not like to say miracle, so they said mechanism and response. But Sebastian didn't care about words, only about the way his son looked a little less far away. In that small shift, there was room for something that felt like a beginning. News did not travel fast to the world because no one had posted anything, but it spread like warmth through the ward. A maid had noticed a dot, and now a child might live. And nurses who had practiced their comfort faces let real smiles slip through, and the respiratory therapist who had braced for decline found himself adjusting settings downward instead. Even the neurologist, with careful voice, let a fraction of relief show. He took Sebastian aside and said quietly, "We were looking for a boulder and missed a pebble. It happens less than rarely, but it happens." And then he went back to work changing a plan that had been written for endings into one that allowed the middle to breathe again. You would think this was the part where everyone hugged and music swelled, but real life prefers slow crescendos. Over the next day, Isaac drifted in and out in longer stretches, reached more purposefully for sounds he loved, flinched less at light, and breathed in a pattern that made machines less necessary. The lab report returned with a name that meant little to most but everything to the team. A species known for a neurotoxin that can cause paralysis that looks like many other frightening things until you find and remove the cause, and the room filled with quiet phrases like consistent with and likely contributor. And when the neurologist said, softly, "We're no longer talking in hours," Sebastian sat down and put his face in his hands and let himself cry the way he had promised he wouldn't in front of his boy. Not everyone liked the story the way it was being told in the hospital halls. Some whispered that it was a coincidence, that improvement was the arc of time, that the parasite was a detail, not the plot, and a hospital PR person suggested they be careful about credit. But the infectious disease specialist shook his head and said the sentence that would become legend on that floor. "If you want to protect the truth, say it plainly. The person who found it saved us from missing it longer." And when a junior resident asked who that person was, a nurse pointed to Maya, who had returned to her usual place at Isaac's side with a smile and a pitcher of water, and said, "Her." The first time Isaac's voice came back, it arrived like rain on dry ground, thin, surprising, more sound than speech. He was trying to say car, one of his favorite words, because Maya had rolled a little toy truck along the blanket the way she always did when he was restless, and he tried again, and the C slipped into a G and then into a whisper that meant yes. And the whole room, Sebastian, the nurse, the therapist, the woman who changed the trash, froze for a heartbeat too long and then exhaled laughter and tears, which often live in the same place. No one filmed it, and maybe that's why it stayed perfect. It didn't need proof to be true. Once the crisis had permission to retreat, work took its place. Rehab mapped the days, small wins stacked on small wins, the first unassisted swallow of applesauce, the first steady sit without leaning into the rails, the first walk with the therapist's belt around his waist, and Maya's voice counting steps softly, and on a morning when the ocean looked like it had decided to be kind, Isaac took 5 steps towards the window on his own and rested his palm on the glass the way he used to at home, as if pressing his hand against the world could make more of it come through. "Look," he whispered, and Maya stood beside him with her hand near his shoulder, not touching unless needed, the way people do when they trust each other's balance.
Beyond the bedside, a different kind of work was beginning. Sebastian, who had felt useless for weeks, now found a purpose he didn't know he needed. He asked the hospital's quality team for a meeting, not to shame anyone but to change the shape of attention, and he said, simply, "We missed a small thing because we didn't expect it to be big. How do we build a habit of checking the quiet places? Behind ears, under hairlines, under collars, when we're drowning in data?" And people who knew how to fix systems nodded, and within a month a new protocol appeared on clipboards and screens with words that looked humble and powerful at the same time. Whole body check, including hidden zones, on every deteriorating case. Invite caregiver observations. Log non-clinical concerns. And in the margins someone had typed, "Credit, caregiver insight." A reporter eventually heard a softened version of the story, as reporters do, and asked for an interview. Sebastian said he didn't want to be on camera, and the hospital declined politely, and Maya said no 3 times with a smile that told you the answer wouldn't change. When pressed about awards and spotlights, she said the only sentence that made sense to her, "I don't want a stage, I want him to go home." If you're wondering whether the 48 hours were wrong from the beginning, or whether a tiny creature had pressed pause on a life without anyone noticing, you're not alone. Even the doctors argued gently about mechanism and meaning in a conference room with bad coffee, but they agreed on one thing: attention saved time, and time saved a child. When Isaac finally returned to the cliffside house, the quiet felt different. It didn't echo the way it used to. The staff had moved furniture out of the way for easier walking, placed bright cards on low tables for visual games, and taped a simple schedule on the fridge that balanced therapy with play. Sebastian carried bags inside himself because it felt like something he could control, and Maya opened the windows because fresh air felt like a prayer. Later, when Isaac fell asleep on the couch with a toy car in his hand, Sebastian stood in the doorway watching him breathe like someone watching the tide after the storm has passed, and he said to Maya without looking away, "They told me 2 days." And Maya answered, "Sometimes everyone looks up at once and misses what's by their feet." And it was the kind of sentence you don't forget. It would be simpler if we stopped here, but life kept moving. A few weeks after the discharge, a lawyer representing the hospital's risk department asked Sebastian to sign a document that, among other things, softened the story. It didn't erase Maya's part, but it made it sound like the improvement had been inevitable. Sebastian read it twice, then set it down and called the infectious disease specialist, who sighed and said he was sorry and that people get nervous when the public wants a hero. But Sebastian had already decided he wasn't going to let the only honest part of this whole thing be edited. He declined the document and instead drafted a letter he didn't publish but sent to every person who had been in the room that first day. It said, "We all did our jobs with care,
but she saved my son, and he signed it with a pen that stopped shaking halfway through his name. Maya declined a medal from a civic group with a warmth that didn't feel like rejection. She said thank you, then didn't show up, and spent that afternoon teaching Isaac how to stack dominoes in a curve that looked like a smile, and when they knocked them down together, and the last one fell exactly where it was supposed to, Isaac laughed the way a child laughs when the world is both surprising and safe. Later that evening, Sebastian found Maya in the kitchen rinsing an apple, and he told her what he'd wanted to say since the first moment he felt air return to the room. "I don't have words enough." And she dried her hands on a towel and said, "You don't need them." And somehow that was enough. The mansion became a home again, not because of art on the walls or music from the speakers, but because people in it were not pretending anymore. Sebastian set up his office at the end of the hall so he could hear therapy sessions, not to hover, but to be near. And half the time he didn't work. He watched, learned how encouragement sounds when it's honest, and practiced failing at building little cardboard towers so Isaac could be the one to show him how to do it right. Maya kept routines simple: meals at the table, walks in the garden when the weather was kind, story time before sleep, and the house began to hum like a living thing again. Even the dog seemed to understand that life had edged back into color. When Isaac returned to school part-time, the first day felt like placing a ship back in water. He held Maya's hand a little too tightly at the gate, then let go to chase a friend who had waited for him by drawing cars on the sidewalk with chalk, and Sebastian stood there for a few minutes longer than he needed to, not because he doubted, but because watching your child run after the storm feels like watching your heart leave your body. That afternoon, Isaac came home with a crumpled paper that said, "Heroes," at the top, and under it he had drawn 3 stick figures, one tall man with messy hair, one small boy with a big smile, and one woman standing between them with a little star above her head. When Sebastian asked who the star was for, Isaac said with complete certainty, "Maya," and then asked for a snack as if he hadn't just rearranged the universe with a crayon.
Time did what it always does, moved forward without asking permission. Months became a year, and on a day when the ocean was bright enough to squint at, Sebastian hosted a small gathering. Not press, not donors, just people who had sat in hard chairs and waited, who had held cups of bad coffee and hope at the same time. Someone brought a cake with a top that looked like a road, and Isaac pushed a toy car across it, making soft engine sounds. And when asked to make a wish, he said out loud, "I don't want wishes, I want more days." And everyone laughed because sometimes the simplest sentences are the ones that land in your chest and live there. Sebastian did one public thing. He created a small fund with a quiet website called The First Look, a promise to train eyes for small things, to teach every caregiver and clinician who wanted to learn to check the quiet places first, and to invite the voices that stand just outside the chart to speak. Maya insisted her name not be on it, and Sebastian agreed, but everyone who knew. In the first year, 4 hospitals added the hidden zones check to their routine, and a nurse in a different city wrote a letter that said a toddler with a frightening weakness got better in hours because someone remembered to look behind an ear. And reading that, Maya sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands and let herself cry, not from sadness this time, but from the relief of knowing that a small act can echo without anyone seeing your face. If you're wondering whether Sebastian and Maya fell in love, that's the wrong story. What formed between them did not need names to be real. It was steadiness, respect, the kind of closeness you get when you survive a night that tried to end you, and people around them learn not to make it smaller by labeling it. They were a family because a boy said so with a drawing and because the house sounded like a home. Years later, on a school stage that smelled like dust and paint, Isaac stood behind a microphone and read a short speech for an assignment called "Someone Who Saved Me." His hands didn't shake, and his voice didn't either. He talked about a day he doesn't fully remember and a night everyone else will never forget, about doctors who worked hard and a father who didn't leave. And then he looked to the side, where Maya stood near the curtains, pretending she wasn't crying, and he said, "Everyone told my dad I had 48 hours, but she gave me the rest." And then he stepped back into the simple life of a boy who wants to build a model car and go home. If you need one more detail to hold on to, remember this. The place where the tiny thief held on is a small, pale scar you can barely find unless Isaac tilts his head and lifts his hair. And sometimes, when the sun lands on it just right, it looks like a grain of salt, a reminder that what burdens us can also season our days in a way we never expected. And if you ask Maya about it, she'll laugh and say, "We keep the hairline short now." And then she'll change the subject because she never liked being the subject. She prefers to be the reason someone else gets to finish a sentence. This story could have ended with a countdown and a calendar, a room gone quiet and a window that stayed closed, but it didn't. because someone who wasn't supposed to matter looked twice and said, "What's that?" And because a father whose life was measured in deals learned that the only numbers worth counting are days spent watching your child run, and because a little boy who once whispered from far away now laughs loudly enough to fill a house. And if you ever find yourself wondering whether ordinary people change the ending, remember the quiet maid who did what love always asks. Pay attention, move gently, and don't look away. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next